So let's kick straight into it. We want to talk about what's happening from a geopolitical instability point of view, starting off. And boy, oh boy, is there a lot happening at the moment. You've got the US election coming up in about 3 weeks. You've got unrest in the Middle East. And then you've got interesting tailwind of economic policy happening over in China. And then we want to talk about, and then we've got an election year next year in Australia, which is, 6 or 7 months away now. So the Australian politicians will be on the election campaign as we speak, essentially. So there's a lot happening there. Let's start with the US and the election. Jonathan, I know you've been doing an incredible amount of analysis. What are your thoughts leading into the finish line of that? What are your thoughts now?
Yeah, well, Eugene, you're absolutely right. We've got a lot of ground to cover today. Some incredibly interesting, exciting, and I think very, very important events on the horizon. First and foremost, of course, we have Tuesday, the 5th of November in the United States. This is going to be the most important election of our lifetime. And there is only one election in the world that affects every citizen in every corner of the world. And of course, it is the United States. So now we're in the final furlong. It looks like Trump is gaining momentum just in the last week or so. And in the latest weekly pain report, Eugene, I did say that I believe Trump will win on Tuesday, the 5th of November. If we go back just a month ago, Harris had the momentum following a very successful debate performance when Trump and Harris had their debate about 4 or 5 weeks ago. She got quite a lot of momentum out of that, but it would appear that in the last week, perhaps 10 days, Trump is nudging ahead. The betting markets now have Trump as favorite, and a composite bookmakers odds tracker, which is a composite of 5 bookmakers, has Trump at around 54% chance of winning, with Harris at about 44-45%. I have now decided, after much procrastination, to suggest that Trump will win. If you recall, when it was Trump up against Biden, I said it was a fait accompli. It was a done deal. Trump would easily beat Biden. The Democrats obviously agreed with that, and they replaced Biden with Harris. I initially thought that the momentum was with Harris, and there would be a lot of energy and excitement around Harris as a candidate. That now seems to be dissipating. That kind of momentum and enthusiasm for Harris seems to be falling away, and Trump now seems to be the favored candidate. In terms of what does that mean? At the end of the day, what does that mean for the world financial markets? Neither candidate, neither Trump nor Harris, has expressed any kind of fiscal discipline. At the end of the day, the budget deficits and the huge levels of US government debt will continue to rise regardless of who wins. On balance, however, Trump's policies are arguably more stimulatory in a fiscal sense. And of course, we've got his much beloved tariffs, which are inflationary. So a Trump presidency would be more inflationary and also serve to increase levels of government debt. In terms of equity markets, if we use 2016 as a playbook, what happened when Trump won in November 2016? Well, we know what happened. Of course, smaller companies performed very, very well. Smaller company business investment sentiment improved noticeably because Trump obviously initiated less regulation and lowered taxes, and of course elevated general sentiment in the smaller business sector in the United States. So the small cap index, RTY, the Russell 2000, performed very well, and I anticipate something similar if Trump wins in a few weeks' time. So net, that's my bottom line. Much too much procrastination with a great sigh of relief. I'm going to try and turn my brain off now as we head towards these last few weeks. I've spent way too much time on the US election. I need to spend more time now on China and Middle East and other things. So that's my bottom line, Eugene.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, it is going to be a close one, but that's interesting analysis. And in terms of what it means for markets, well, and yeah, I guess it's important to understand that whoever wins, we're still going to have a debt issue in the US, and I don't think that's going to come to a head anytime soon. Anyway, but it'll be interesting to see where that ends up medium and longer term. But you mentioned China and the Middle East, and look, it's really unfortunate what's been happening in the Middle East. Interesting to talk about that and to hear your thoughts on that, as well as how the conflict in the Middle East may influence the US election, and potentially because of the upcoming US election, what pressure the US government may be putting on Israel in terms of their response to the attack from Iran.
Yeah, absolutely, Eugene. Look, this is an area of real interest for me. I lived 9 years in the Middle East, and I love the region. Traveled very extensively when I lived there for 9 years. I've returned many times to the region. I've studied the region now for nearly 40 years. I have a really strong passion for its history, and I have enormous interest in the politics. So let's just take a very brief step back. Very recently, Iran launched nearly 200 ballistic missiles at Israel. That's the largest ballistic missile attack in the history of conflict. Israel is going to respond, and it could respond while we're actually conducting this conversation. It is imminent, but there is no doubt that Israel is going to respond. And what I've been trying to do through my pain reports in the last few weeks is to think about the potential scenarios and the potential targets, because that's going to be critical. But the bottom line is this: my primary message is that both Israel and Iran have both put their feet on an escalatory ladder. And we don't know how high up that ladder both these nations are going to travel. But we also sadly know what is at the end of that ladder, and we don't even want to have that conversation. Yes, the United States, you're absolutely right, Eugene, is putting huge pressure on the Netanyahu government as to how they respond to the Iranian ballistic missile attack. So in terms of the potential retaliation by Israel, Israel has certain targets, potential targets in Iran, and they are as follows. Clearly, there's the military installations and infrastructure. They could target the ballistic missile sites. There's also another option that Israel targets Iran's oil infrastructure and installations. And there the target is very straightforward, because 90% of Iranian exports come out of the Karg oil terminal, which is located on the Karg Island, which is in the northern part of the Persian Gulf. And Karg Island is obviously an island off the coast of Iran. Extremely easy target for Israel to hit. And it would, of course, have devastating economic impact upon the Iranian economy. As I said, 90% of Iranian exports come out from the Karg oil terminal. Now, the Biden administration are particularly keen that the Israelis don't hit the Karg oil terminal because, of course, we have an election in the United States, and they don't want to see a sharp rise in gasoline prices on the eve of an election. So there's obviously a lot at stake here. And then, of course, the kind of almost worst case scenario in terms of retaliation is for Israel to target the Iranian nuclear installations, which are very dispersed right across Iran and also at very great depth. This is by far and away the most complex bombing mission for Israel. And it is my view, with many other military experts, that Israel couldn't do it on its own. They'd have to use the United States. There's a couple of things. Number one, the bomb, the so-called bunker buster bombs, are made by the United States, and only a US aircraft had the delivery mechanism. And moreover, Israeli Air Force jets would have to refuel on the way back, and they'd probably have to be refueled by US aircraft. So it's a much more complex mission, and I think that is a fairly low possibility. Then, if you really want to carry on this so-called escalatory ladder, and there's plausibility to every rung on this escalatory ladder, the kind of doomsday for the oil market is, of course, Iran responding by closing the Strait of Hormuz, which, as you know, is the choke point at the southernmost end of the Persian Gulf, through which 20% of crude oil every day. And don't forget also the very large natural gas exports that go through that area as well, that come primarily out of Qatar. So any closure or threat of closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and the oil price, Eugene, would trade at $100 in the first second, then $120 after 15 seconds. It would be devastating. So these are the potential targets that Israel could have. Obviously, highest probability against military installations, though I do note that the Israeli defense minister recently did say that it's going to be a very significant attack and it's going to surprise everyone, which I'm not quite sure what that means. So the bottom line is we are literally on the edge here of a further escalation in the conflict. All the red lines have been crossed. For those of us who've studied the Middle East for many, many years, will know that the red lines were crossed in April when Iran first attacked Israel directly, and then Israel responded, but only in a very limited and surgical attack on anti-aircraft radar systems outside of Isfahan. This attack Israel is going to be far more significant. And we also think that Iran will respond to this new Israeli attack. And that's why we talk about this escalatory ladder. And obviously, many, many parties are trying to prevent Israel and Iran, climbing ever higher on this escalatory ladder. I'll leave the conversation with just a couple of observations. I listened to all of the speeches by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I follow every statement coming out of the cabinet and out of the government. I've seen all the speeches. I've also been following all of the public statements made by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the leader of Iran. Neither of these individuals, to me, show any signs of stepping off that escalatory ladder. And I do believe that much of the world is underestimating the resolve of both these leaders to escalate this conflict even further. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, it sounds like this has been building for some time. All right, well, and it sounds as though there's lots of different ways it can go, and it'll be a step-by-step process, and the next step will depend on how the other side reacts. So, yeah, but it's a very unfortunate situations which will have significant cascading impacts on the rest of the world. So, all right, let's turn to something perhaps more positive, which is China and the recent government announcements that they're looking to stimulate the economy, in effect, and how this perhaps wasn't that expected, despite the fact that the Chinese do like to stimulate when they think it's the right time. Can you give us some insight into that and what you think the impact's going to be from that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. This is, I think it is big news, and it is also significant because we've kind of been waiting for the Chinese government to admit or acknowledge that the economy was in serious trouble. I mean, we all know where this started with the bursting of the Chinese property bubble 3 years ago. And since that time, we've just seen a continuing worsening in the property market in China. And the property market is such an incredibly large part of the economy. Anyway, I think I'm right in saying on September the 21st, the relatively new People's Bank of China governor, Pan, basically did a Draghi. You remember Mario Draghi in what was it, June or July of 2011 said, we'll do whatever it takes to save the euro, and believe me, it'll be enough. Well, Governor Pan, at a very hastily arranged press conference, announced a whole series of stimulatory monetary measures, which were really, really quite significant. And so we all kind of got quite intrigued by all of that. However, what we also know is that China needs fiscal stimulus. It's all very well having monetary stimulus, but as our, the very eminent British economist John Maynard Keynes described as a liquidity trap is where borrowers don't want to borrow and want to lend, very analogous to what happened in Japan in the 90s. And China arguably has entered a kind of Keynesian liquidity trap. And a liquidity trap characterized by deflation as well. So this weekend, and I'm sure all of you spent the weekend waiting for it, the Minister of Finance, the Finance Minister, unveiled the missing piece, the missing fiscal piece of this economic stimulatory jigsaw puzzle. But it was a little bit disappointing, I'm afraid to say. We need to get a little bit more detail. We wanted a more explicit fiscal stimulus package. The finance minister, however, basically said, yes, they're going to stimulate. Yes, they're going to tolerate a higher budget deficit, which is currently kind of limited at 3% of GDP, budget deficit 3% of GDP. But now wait for the Politburo to have further discussions at the end of the month. So, as we speak, I haven't yet seen the opening prices in some of the Chinese equity markets, but I think the market's going to be a bit disappointed. But I think what we can say, Eugene, is there's a growing realization, particularly a growing awareness by President Xi Jinping, that yes, China is in trouble. Yes, there are deflationary forces. The property market is very seriously weak, and the government needs to step in. The central bank has provided lots of monetary stimulus. Now the government needs to provide fiscal stimulus. We got an outline, an overview of potential fiscal stimulation, but we didn't get the nitty-gritty. We didn't get the real explicit detail, which we hope is forthcoming. But the bottom line, return, as you know, Eugene, to the Chinese equity markets, it was blistering. We saw dramatic rises in Chinese equity markets, Shanghai Shenzhen, the CSI 300, the Hang Seng in Hong Kong, and other various indices blasted off like rockets. And then, of course, came back to earth a little bit last week. And I suspect it's going to have a bit of a soft opening today because of slight disappointment as to the lack of explicit detail about this fiscal stimulus package.
That's the reaction of the local Chinese market. I think even if the stimulus is underwhelming, is it fair to assume that it's still likely to be a tailwind for global markets? Because I don't think any Chinese stimulus was priced in up until those events not that long ago. Would that be fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. So if you had asked me a month ago, did I think that Xi Jinping had kind of got the message and that Xi Jinping would authorize a significant fiscal stimulus? My answer to you a month ago, if you had asked that question, would have been no, probably not, because Xi Jinping has constantly said, basically, that's not what he wants to happen. But I think, and what we saw just in the lead up to the 21st of September were a number of former very senior policy advisors who went on public record basically saying, China needs to change its ways and the government needs to respond to what is a deepening property crisis. And also, as we know, business and consumer confidence in China has been near rock bottom now for a number of years. So it looks as if the advisors have finally got through to Xi Jinping, and nothing will happen in China, obviously, without the president effectively signing off on it. So, yeah, I agree with you. The intent to increase fiscal stimulus has come as a bit of a surprise and has reignited some of the kind of animal spirits in the Chinese equity markets. And as you say, I think it's correct to use the phrase that this type of fiscal stimulus is a tailwind that wasn't there just a month ago.
Yeah. So we're interested to see how this plays out, but obviously it's impossible to know how much of a tailwind, if any, it's going to be until we have the details.